I knew the dive was wrong before I even took my gloves off, because my hands were shaking in a way cold water doesn't cause. I was standing in the narrow corridor outside the equipment bay, watching condensation slide down the camera housing like it was breathing. The dive itself had been routine, almost boring, but my body felt like it had stayed behind at depth. That's when I remembered we weren't just given safety protocols out here. We were given 11 strange rules to follow if we wanted to come back the same. I told myself I'd only bent one. Something small. The footage was already loading when I understood that rules don't punish you immediately. I learned this rule the wrong way, standing alone in the equipment bay with salt still drying on my neck, replaying a dive that felt shorter in my body than it did on the screen. Rule 1. Always review your footage without sound, no matter how harmless it looks. It wasn't written anywhere official, not on the laminated cards or the briefing screens, but it had been passed to me quietly like an apology. At the time, I treated it like a superstition, the kind people invent when they spend too long isolated from sunlight. I didn't understand that it wasn't meant to protect my ears, but my sense of sequence. The bay lights were set to night mode, dim and bluish, making everything feel further away than it was. I connected my camera to the terminal and watched the file list populate, noticing gaps in the timestamps that I couldn't explain. My dive log said one thing, the footage said another, and I felt a subtle irritation at myself for being sloppy. That irritation mattered more than fear in that moment because it made me rush. I wanted the review done so I could sleep and reset my head. Watching without sound forced my attention onto details I normally skimmed past. Fine debris drifted in patterns that didn't match the current data, and the light from my rig bent strangely along the trench wall. I saw my own hand enter the frame to adjust focus, but the motion lagged, as if the camera remembered it differently than I did. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to recall what I'd been thinking during that adjustment. The memory refused to surface, like a word on the tip of my tongue. Halfway through the footage, the camera angle shifted upward for several seconds, pointing into open water where there was nothing scheduled to be. I knew my assignment well, and there had been no reason to tilt away from the wall at that depth. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with the uncomfortable sense that something had been decided without my awareness. I tried to reconstruct the moment logically, telling myself I'd followed a reflection or a sensor anomaly. The problem was that logic felt added after the fact, like a caption written long after the photo was taken. I paused the playback and rubbed my eyes, noticing how heavy my body felt, as if gravity had increased while I wasn't paying attention. The equipment bay smelled faintly metallic, and the floor vibrated under my feet as the station adjusted to pressure changes outside. I realized I hadn't taken my wetsuit off yet, that I was still dressed like the dive hadn't ended. That small detail unsettled me more than the footage, because it suggested a gap between intention and action. I told myself I was just tired, that everyone feels disjointed after deep water. When I resumed the video, I noticed movement at the edge of the frame that didn't resolve into any known organism. It wasn't dramatic or fast, just a subtle distortion where the water seemed thicker. My first instinct was to reach for the audio controls, to ground the image with something familiar. I stopped myself at the last second, not out of discipline, but because I suddenly couldn't remember what the ambient dive audio usually sounded like. That absence felt deliberate, like something had been removed cleanly. I thought of Malik then, the way he'd cleaned lenses slowly, never rushing, never talking unless someone asked directly. He'd told me once that sound makes you trust what you shouldn't, that it fills in gaps your eyes are trying to warn you about. At the time I joked that he was becoming paranoid, spending too much time staring into dark water. Remembering his face now, I couldn't picture him laughing at that joke. I couldn't picture him laughing at all. The footage continued, showing the camera drifting closer to the trench wall than I remembered allowing. The light revealed textures I hadn't seen before, grooves that looked almost deliberate in their spacing. I felt a faint embarrassment, as if I were invading something private without understanding why. That feeling didn't belong in a technical review, and its presence irritated me. I prided myself on being methodical, on keeping emotion separate from documentation. At one point, the camera stopped moving entirely, hovering in place for longer than any stabilization system should allow. I leaned forward unconsciously, holding my breath without realizing it. The image itself didn't change, but my perception of it did, like my eyes were adjusting to a different scale. I became aware of how long I'd been standing there, how my legs ached slightly, how the room felt smaller than before. It occurred to me that I hadn't checked the time once since starting the review. I forced myself to step back and stretch, breaking whatever focus had taken hold. The terminal clock showed a gap I couldn't account for, minutes missing between pauses that hadn't felt that long. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself that fatigue plays tricks, especially after repetitive visual tasks. Still, I saved the footage without adding notes, something I'd never done before. That omission would bother me later, but in the moment, I just wanted distance from the screen. As I disconnected the camera, I noticed faint residue along the housing seam, darker than the usual sediment. I wiped it with my thumb and stared at the smear on my glove, unable to place its texture. The bay lights flickered slightly, just enough to draw my attention upward. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to my own breathing and realizing how loud it sounded in my helmetless head. Whatever had been recorded down there wasn't finished with me yet, and I had the uneasy sense that reviewing it was only the first accommodation I'd made without understanding the cost. I didn't learn this rule from a warning or a story. I learned it from the way my hands moved without asking me. Rule 2. Never review more than one dive in a single sitting. That sentence surfaced in my head while I was still standing in the equipment bay. Camera disconnected, screen dark, my body leaning toward the terminal like it expected something else to appear. I hadn't planned to load another file, but my fingers were already typing, calling up the previous day's dive, as if continuity mattered more than rest. There was a subtle pressure behind my eyes, not pain, just insistence, and I mistook it for professional diligence. The second file opened faster than the first, skipping the small loading delay I was used to. That should have bothered me, but instead it felt relieving, like the system and I were finally cooperating. This dive was older, shallower, routine work along a slope I could practically map from memory. As the footage played, I noticed how easily my posture settled into place, how my breathing slowed, how the room seemed to accommodate me. It felt like sliding back into a familiar chair, the kind that remembers your weight. The strange thing was how the two dives began to overlap in my mind. The textures from the trench wall in the newer footage blended with the smoother sediment from the older slope, creating a composite image I couldn't separate. I paused the video, trying to clear my head, but the afterimage stayed, lingering like light pressed into the back of my eyes. I told myself this was normal, that any photographer who stares too long at similar environments experiences bleed through. The explanation sounded reasonable enough to let me continue. As the second dive progressed, small inconsistencies started to surface. A cable marker appeared in a place it shouldn't have been, angled wrong. Its identifying strip faded in a pattern I didn't recognize. I leaned closer, scanning for a timestamp to confirm which dive I was actually watching. The numbers were there, crisp and correct, but they didn't anchor me the way they should have. I realized I was relying on memory to interpret what I saw, and memory felt less solid than it had earlier. The equipment bay grew warmer, or maybe I noticed the warmth for the first time. My suit was still half-zipped, neoprene clinging uncomfortably to my shoulders, but I didn't move to remove it. Part of me didn't want to break the sequence I'd fallen into, the quiet loop of watching and recognizing and adjusting. I told myself I'd finish this one clip, add notes, and then stop. That promise felt genuine when I made it. Somewhere near the middle of the footage, the camera lingered on an area I knew I hadn't flagged during the dive. It wasn't a dramatic feature, just an uneven depression in the sediment, but the framing was deliberate. I felt a flicker of irritation at my past self for wasting recording time on something so unremarkable. Then it occurred to me that I didn't remember choosing that framing at all. The irritation shifted, becoming something more cautious, like a hand hovering near a hot surface. I rewound slightly and watched the approach again, paying attention to the movement leading up to it. The camera's path felt smooth, confident, not like something done absent-mindedly. I tried to reconstruct the moment mentally, placing myself back inside the suit, lights cutting through murk, my focus narrowed to task objectives. The reconstruction refused to align with the footage. It was as if I were watching a colleague's work and mistaking it for my own. The awareness that I'd been standing for a long time finally broke through. My calves ached, and when I shifted my weight, pins and needles spread through my feet. The terminal clock had advanced more than I expected, though I couldn't say exactly how much more. I felt an urge to sit down, to ground myself physically, but the chair behind me felt irrelevant, almost intrusive. Staying upright seemed important, even if I didn't know why. I became conscious of how quiet the bay felt, not in volume, but in texture. The usual background sensations I filtered out had flattened into something uniform, making it hard to judge distance. My own movements felt slightly delayed, like my body was waiting for confirmation before obeying. I flexed my fingers, watching the motion carefully, reassured when it matched my intention. That small test calmed me enough to keep going. Near the end of the second dive footage, the camera passed over a reflective surface, likely a mineral deposit, and for a fraction of a second, the reflection caught something that looked like a shape behind the lens. I froze the frame and leaned in, heart rate ticking up just enough to be noticeable. The shape didn't resolve into anything identifiable, and the more I stared, the less confident I became in what I'd seen. I told myself reflections are unreliable underwater, especially at odd angles. What unsettled me wasn't the image itself, but the certainty that if I loaded a third file, it would feel just as necessary as the second. That realization landed quietly, without drama, and that made it harder to dismiss. I finally stepped back from the terminal, breaking the invisible line I'd been holding. The room seemed to expand again, sounds regaining depth, my body reminding me of its limits. I saved the second review with minimal notes, another deviation from my usual habits, and disconnected the drive. As I turned away, a thought surfaced uninvited, heavy with implication, that rules like this weren't about managing time or workload. They were about preventing accumulation, about keeping experiences from stacking in ways that changed how they pressed back. I didn't yet know what too much would feel like, but I had the uncomfortable sense I'd come closer than I realized. This rule didn't come to me as a warning. It came as an accusation, surfacing while I stared at the half-written notes blinking on the terminal. Rule 3. Never annotate footage while you are still emotionally attached to the dive. I hadn't planned to write anything at all, but my hands had opened the annotation panel on their own, the cursor pulsing patiently, like it trusted me. There was a tightness in my chest that didn't feel like fear, more like ownership, as if the footage belonged to me in a way it shouldn't. I mistook that feeling for responsibility, which was my first real mistake with this rule. I told myself that writing notes would help me regain control, that naming details always steadied me. The problem was that every word I typed felt heavier than it should, loaded with something I couldn't quite identify. I described lighting conditions, camera angle, particulate density, all the neutral language I'd been trained to use. Still, my sentences kept drifting, slipping subtle judgments into places they didn't belong. Words like intentional and hesitant crept in before I noticed them. As I reread what I'd written, I felt a faint embarrassment, the kind that comes when you realize you've revealed more than you meant to. The notes didn't just document the footage, they documented me. They carried traces of my uncertainty, my irritation, the strange familiarity I'd felt watching things I didn't remember choosing to record. I hovered over the delete key, considering wiping it all, but the thought of erasing those lines made my stomach twist. It felt less like deleting text, and more like denying something that had already happened. I tried to distance myself by focusing on technical precision, tightening phrases, removing anything that hinted at interpretation. But the more clinical I became, the more distorted the notes felt, like a forced smile in a photograph. The footage and the words no longer matched, and that mismatch unsettled me more than either one alone. I realized I was still inside the dive emotionally, still reacting as if I were underwater, even though my body was dry and upright. That attachment made every decision feel personal. The equipment bay seemed to close in as I worked, not physically, but perceptually. The terminal glow dominated my vision, flattening everything else into background shapes. I lost track of how long I'd been adjusting the same paragraph, chasing a version of it that felt right without knowing what that meant. Each time I paused, I felt an urge to justify myself, to explain why I'd focused on certain moments in the footage. There was no one there to read the notes yet, but I felt watched all the same. I noticed that my language shifted when I described the section where the camera lingered unexpectedly. Instead of noting duration or framing, I'd written that the camera seemed to wait. That word sat there quietly, undeniable. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was harmless shorthand. The longer I looked, the more deliberate it felt, like a choice I'd made without realizing why. My shoulders ached, and when I rolled them, I became aware of how rigid I'd been standing. The physical discomfort grounded me briefly, reminding me that I could step away. I closed the annotation panel halfway, then reopened it, caught between relief and compulsion. It occurred to me that annotating was keeping the dive alive, preventing it from settling into the past where it belonged. As long as I was writing, I was still there. I thought about Malik again, about how sparse his notes always were, almost frustratingly so. I'd teased him once for being lazy with documentation, and he'd shrugged, saying too much detail locks things in place. At the time I hadn't understood what he meant, assuming he was just tired of explaining himself. Standing there now, his habit took on a different shape. Maybe restraint wasn't about effort, but about survival. I forced myself to save the annotations as a draft, not finalized, telling myself that was a compromise. The word draft felt temporary, safe, like a promise I could revisit later. But as soon as the file saved, a wave of unease passed through me, subtle but persistent. It felt like I'd acknowledged something without fully committing to it, leaving it suspended. That suspension made the room feel slightly off balance. When I finally closed the terminal, the afterimage of text lingered in my vision, lines ghosting across darker surfaces. I blinked hard, shaking my head, annoyed at myself for letting a routine task stretch this far. The rational part of me insisted that none of this mattered, that fatigue and isolation were amplifying normal reactions. Another part, quieter and harder to argue with, felt like I'd crossed a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed simply by stopping. As I turned away from the console, I had the distinct impression that the footage was more settled now than I was, as if it had been waiting for my input to reach a certain state. That thought didn't come with panic, just a dull heaviness behind my eyes. I told myself I'd rest, put distance between me and the dive, and come back clearer. But even as I thought it, I wasn't sure distance worked the same way down here, or if some attachments only loosen after they've already changed you. This rule surfaced later than the others, not as advice, but as a quiet recollection that settled in, while I stood outside the equipment bay. Lights dimmed for night cycle. Rule 4. Never watch the footage alone after the first night cycle. I remembered someone saying it during my initial assignment briefing, not emphasized, almost buried between procedural notes. At the time I'd assumed it was about accountability or fatigue management. Standing there now, alone by choice, I realized it was about something far less administrative. The corridor felt longer than usual, the walls reflecting just enough light to make depth hard to judge. I hesitated before re-entering the bay, aware of how deliberate that hesitation felt. There was no order stopping me, no alarm, no physical barrier. The only resistance came from inside, a mild pressure that suggested waiting would be smarter. I dismissed it as nerves, irritated with myself for indulging superstition. Inside, the terminal screen was still dark, but it felt present, like something paused mid-thought. I activated it without sitting down, choosing to remain standing, as if posture might keep me alert. The footage resumed where I'd left it earlier, the image stabilizing quickly. Without realizing it, I scanned the room first, noting the empty chair, the closed hatch, the absence of anyone else. That awareness sharpened my focus in a way that felt unnatural. Watching alone changed how the footage behaved, or maybe how I perceived it. Without another presence nearby, there was no external rhythm to anchor me, no casual movement or shared silence. My breathing became the dominant reference point, rising and falling as the only proof of time passing. The image on the screen felt closer, less mediated, like it was occurring directly in front of me, rather than recorded earlier. That immediacy made my skin prickle. I caught myself leaning in again, repeating the same posture I'd adopted before without meaning to. The camera drifted across familiar terrain, but my reaction lagged behind recognition, as if my mind were processing a fraction too late. I noticed small details more sharply, tiny shifts in lighting, the way particulate seemed to hesitate before settling. Those hesitations echoed my own, creating an uncomfortable symmetry. I wondered briefly if that was why this rule existed. A thought crossed my mind that I should fetch someone, anyone, to stand nearby while I finished the review. The idea felt oddly intrusive, like bringing a witness into something private. I argued with myself internally, listing practical reasons it wasn't necessary. Everyone else was on rest cycle, and waking someone would mean paperwork and explanations. The inconvenience outweighed the vague unease, or at least that's what I told myself. As the footage progressed, the sense of isolation deepened, not just physically but cognitively. My thoughts looped inward, circling the same interpretations without resolving them. I became aware of how easily I was assigning intention to movement, reading purpose into neutral drift. Without another person to ground the moment, my assumptions went unchallenged. That unchecked space felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate. There was a moment when the camera's light swept across open water, and nothing filled the frame but darkness textured by particles. I felt a sudden urge to speak, to say something out loud just to confirm my voice existed. The urge passed quickly, replaced by a tightness in my throat. I realized then how quiet I'd been, how long it had been since I'd made any sound at all. The absence felt heavier than noise ever could. I stepped back from the terminal, breaking the spell enough to notice how tense my shoulders were. The room didn't change, but my perception of it did, edges sharpening, distance returning. I closed the playback without finishing the file, my hand shaking slightly as I did. The relief was immediate, but incomplete, like stopping a thought mid-sentence. Something felt left unresolved, hanging in the air behind me. As I left the bay, I avoided looking back at the terminal, aware that doing so would draw me in again. The corridor lights guided me away, each step restoring a sense of sequence I hadn't realized I'd lost. I understood then that being alone wasn't just about safety or sanity. It altered the relationship between observer and image, collapsing a distance that needed to stay intact. Whatever came next, I knew isolation would no longer feel neutral, and that knowledge settled into me quietly, without offering comfort. I realized how fragile memory had become when the footage timestamp didn't match the dive log by nearly 7 minutes. Rule 5. Always cross-check timestamps with your dive log before making any judgments. I hadn't done it yet, too absorbed in the images, too willing to trust my eyes over the instruments. The station's clock ticked steadily above the terminal, indifferent, reminding me that the world outside the water had its own unbending rhythm. I rubbed my temples, trying to reconcile what I saw on screen with what I remembered experiencing underwater. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic, just enough to make me pause, enough to unsettle the faint confidence I had left. Every time-stamped frame now seemed suspicious, a fragment floating without context. I leaned back slightly, letting the chair creak beneath me, listening to its familiar protest. My hands hovered above the keyboard, unsure if pressing play again would clarify or deepen the anomaly. Logic argued one way, instinct whispered another. I opened the dive log, fingers tracing lines I had filled meticulously, and compared them against the playback. Sediment clouds, the slow drift of my submersible, the timing of marker drops, they all sat on opposite planes. I wanted to believe one set was wrong, but both seemed infallible. My stomach tightened. Somewhere in that divergence lay a gap I couldn't comprehend, a sliver where intention, action, and recording no longer aligned. The terminal light reflected in my eyes, creating a double image that mirrored the mismatch on screen. Every shift in the footage felt exaggerated, every movement longer or shorter than I remembered. I replayed the same 5 seconds multiple times, measuring durations against the log, my pulse a steady counterpoint to the dissonance. What should have been mundane technical verification became an unnerving study in temporal inconsistency. I thought of Malik's calm voice, reminding me once that technology can't lie, but human perception always does. It was easy to nod along then, but standing there staring at numbers and frames that refused to match, I understood the weight of his words. Even the best instruments don't matter if your interpretation bends before reality. That small lesson carried a quiet pressure, one I felt pressing down through my spine. As I traced my dive path frame by frame, I noticed minor anomalies. A marker slightly shifted, the angle of a sediment plume subtly off, shadows in places they shouldn't be. My initial irritation shifted into a slow creeping doubt. How much of what I remembered had been reconstructed incorrectly? How much of it had already been altered by fatigue or misperception? Each question nested inside the last, leaving a hollow space I couldn't fill. I adjusted the brightness and contrast on the footage, trying to match environmental conditions logged during the dive. Even that didn't help. The video looked right, technically perfect, yet it contradicted the recorded log in imperceptible ways. I felt a subtle nausea, that creeping awareness that facts can remain unchallenged while perception warps. My own body seemed foreign, my hands awkward with the mouse, as if they remembered a different set of movements than the ones I was making. Somewhere during the comparison, I realized I'd stopped blinking intentionally, caught in the effort to reconcile two versions of reality. My eyes burned slightly, my thoughts looping back to the same frames again and again. The footage didn't seem malevolent, but the way it resisted clarity felt deliberate. I told myself I was imagining it, that cognitive fatigue makes patterns where none exist. The explanation settled, but it didn't reassure me. I tried documenting the discrepancies for later review, but every note I typed carried a lingering uncertainty. My own handwriting, neat and controlled, now felt like a translation of doubt, each letter an admission of imbalance. I hesitated before saving, realizing that acknowledging inconsistencies had its own weight, a subtle admission that control was slipping. The file went into the draft folder, but I didn't trust it. As I closed the log and leaned back, I felt the gravity of waiting for time to pass, for the gaps to align, for some future verification that might never come. My pulse had slowed, but unease remained, tethered to the knowledge that perception could betray me as easily as error. The station hummed around me, indifferent machinery continuing its eternal cycle. Somewhere in that hum, I sensed a rhythm I wasn't part of yet, one I needed to respect if I wanted the next step to feel safe. I realized the danger of this rule when I leaned forward to rotate the live feed slightly, trying to catch a detail that tugged at the edge of my memory. Rule 6. Never adjust the camera's angle to revisit something you think you missed. The thought seemed harmless at first, just a small correction. But as my fingers hovered over the controls, I felt an unspoken warning coil in my chest. I reminded myself that the footage was already perfect as recorded, that changing perspective wouldn't improve clarity. Still, curiosity pressed forward, like water filling an unsealed chamber. The first shift of the camera was subtle, just a few degrees, but the sediment patterns responded in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Tiny particles suspended in the water seemed to float against the current, moving like a ripple of deliberate intention. I blinked rapidly, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the lighting, of the reflection of my console. My pulse picked up unconsciously, and I realized I hadn't exhaled in several seconds. The harmless adjustment had already made the environment feel unstable. As I continued, the trench wall appeared to elongate slightly, stretching at the edges of the frame, subtle but undeniable. I tried to revert the camera, but the controls resisted in a way that was almost imperceptible. The software confirmed no errors, no lag, yet the visual anomaly persisted. My mind raced, searching for rational explanations, mapping every conceivable fault in recording or playback. None fit, and I felt a creeping tightness in my throat that wasn't quite panic, but too sharp to ignore. The longer I held the adjustment, the more other irregularities surfaced. Small shadows lingered in corners that should have been empty, faint undulations suggesting motion without cause. I questioned whether my initial memory of the dive had been accurate at all, realizing I was comparing reality against a record that refused to remain fixed. That single adjustment had introduced doubt, threading it through every frame, seeping into the rhythm of my own recollections. I tried to distract myself by focusing on a neutral section of the footage, letting the camera drift over familiar terrain without interaction. The movement should have been soothing, predictable, but every particle seemed to hover a fraction too long, like it remembered the adjustment. I pinched the bridge of my nose, willing my mind to recalibrate, but the feeling persisted. The footage, once a tool, had become a living puzzle I had disturbed. A faint, almost imperceptible detail appeared at the edge of the adjusted frame, a shape that didn't belong, a bend in the light that wasn't in the original dive log. I froze, breath shallow, wondering whether I'd imagined it. My hands hovered above the controls, tempted to correct it again, to find clarity in movement. The thought felt urgent, insistent, like a whispered command. I resisted, teeth clenched, realizing that control itself had become part of the trap. Time began to feel distorted as I watched the altered angle. Seconds seemed longer, stretching across frames with uneven rhythm. I remembered Malik's warnings about interference from curiosity, the way revisiting what you think you missed always comes at a cost. At the time, I'd treated it as hyperbole. Now it made perfect sense. The footage was patient, waiting, and every adjustment brought me closer to something I couldn't yet define. Eventually, I forced myself to return the camera to its original orientation. Even then, subtle anomalies lingered, small shifts in light, an offset in particle drift. My body tensed against the chair, unwilling to settle fully. I realized that the simple act of trying to see more than was recorded had altered my perception irreversibly, leaving questions where certainty should have been. The lesson wasn't immediate danger, but a slow creeping awareness that observation can be invasive. I stepped back, rubbing my wrists where the gloves had left impressions, trying to shake off the creeping unease. The trench on the screen looked calm again, perfectly aligned and unthreatening, yet I could feel the subtle resonance of my interference lingering in my mind. I knew then that small temptations, the ones that felt insignificant, carried consequences that weren't always immediate. Some lessons were learned quietly, pressed into you with the patience of pressure and water. I left the terminal for a moment, letting my gaze wander across the bay, counting the equipment silently as a grounding exercise. The unease didn't vanish, but I could manage it with deliberate movements and measured breathing. The room hummed normally, indifferent to my inner disquiet, and yet I couldn't shake the impression that the footage remembered my adjustment, carrying it forward as a subtle signal I wasn't meant to interpret. I realized the weight of this rule when a dark shape lingered at the edge of one frame, subtle, almost insignificant, yet undeniably present. Rule 7. Never attempt to identify unknown objects in the footage. My curiosity pulled at me before I even recognized it, fingers hovering over the zoom and contrast controls like a reflex. I reminded myself to stop, to follow the protocols ingrained by training, yet the mind resists orders stronger than any muscle. That shadow demanded meaning, and I felt my resolve bending. I leaned closer, blinking against the pale glow of the terminal, and the shape shifted imperceptibly, as if it responded to my gaze. I told myself it was sediment, a trick of the lighting, or perhaps a reflection from a rock formation. Rationalizations piled up in my head, arguments meant to dismiss the possibility that it was anything else. But each explanation carried the faint taste of inadequacy, as if reasoning were insufficient to maintain balance. My pulse quickened slightly, a gentle rhythm that felt loud in the emptiness of the bay. Every subtle feature of the object invited comparison, coaxing me into speculation. It had contours that seemed deliberate, edges that caught the camera light differently than surrounding surfaces. I found myself tracing lines with my finger on the screen, not touching the display, just following the illusion of form. The rational part of my mind insisted it was irrelevant, yet the rest of me refused to disengage. I realized then how easy it was to mistake attention for understanding. I tried to refocus on the broader frame, allowing the camera feed to drift across familiar sediment slopes, familiar cables, familiar shadowed corners, but the shape remained at the periphery of my vision, insisting on presence. My eyes darted back despite my own warning, and every return visit to it made the room feel slightly smaller. Even the station's machinery seemed more pronounced, like a distant heartbeat in contrast to my racing awareness. The simple act of looking felt consequential. I recalled Malik's words, said during a night shift when we reviewed similar footage together. Some things are meant to be cataloged, not named. Giving them a title invites ownership. At the time I had nodded absently, assuming it was his usual cryptic humor. Now, standing alone, I understood the truth behind the statement. Assigning meaning to unknown forms had weight, and that weight pressed subtly against my consciousness. I resisted it, shaking my head as if physical motion could unthread the thought. The longer I stared, the more I noticed tiny anomalies around the shape. A shadow slightly out of sync, a flicker that didn't match sediment drift, a distortion that paused longer than natural. My instincts screamed to label it, to give it a name, even just for my own reassurance. But each temptation felt like stepping closer to a line I couldn't see, one that would separate observation from involvement. I realized that some knowledge, once pursued, could not be ignored or undone. I forced myself to scroll past it in the footage, letting the frame continue without lingering. The motion helped briefly, the camera's drift guiding my perception away from the anomaly. Yet the space it had occupied remained vivid in my mind, a placeholder for something I wasn't allowed to define. Every instinct to check again required conscious suppression, each suppression a small exercise in discipline. I felt the exhaustion of mental restraint settle in my shoulders. I stepped back from the terminal, realizing that physical distance could not sever the psychological pull. Even out of direct sight, the object persisted as a whisper in my awareness, a reminder of limits I had yet to internalize. The room's blue glow no longer felt neutral, every reflective surface caught in my peripheral vision, each one suggesting potential intrusion. I understood that looking, really looking, had consequences that weren't immediate, and the lesson was carved quietly into the mind. I left the bay, letting the terminal remain active while I walked down the corridor, counting my steps to anchor myself. My pulse slowed, but unease remained, threaded through attention and anticipation. The rule wasn't about safety, about avoiding harm in any immediate sense. It was about maintaining distance, keeping unknowns at bay, until you were equipped to survive their full significance. And even then, survival felt uncertain, suspended in a quiet, insistent tension I could not shake. I discovered the danger of this rule when my eyes locked on a brief segment of footage, the one where the sediment drifted like smoke around something I couldn't identify. Rule 8. Never replay a sequence more than 3 times. My fingers hovered over the playback controls, each repetition tempting me with the illusion of clarity. I told myself the third watch would be enough, that I could finally catalog it without misinterpretation. The first view revealed nothing alarming, the second sharpened my attention, and the third began to feel insistent, like it had expectations of me. As I watched for the third time, subtle distortions emerged that weren't there before, or maybe I simply noticed them. The particles moved in ways inconsistent with physics, swaying slightly longer before settling, creating the impression of unseen currents. My hands grew tense, pressing the console edges without meaning to. I felt a strange combination of fascination and dread, the way curiosity and caution coiled in the chest together. That single repeated sequence was bending my perception. Slowly, imperceptibly. I tried to tell myself it was fatigue, or the dim night cycle lighting affecting contrast perception. Every rational explanation collided with instinct, the part of me that felt something was deliberately wrong. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen, trying to measure differences frame by frame. Each micro-adjustment only increased unease. The footage seemed to resist familiarity. I realized then that repetition itself invited subtle alterations, a pressure I hadn't accounted for before. The third repetition revealed a flicker near the trench wall, almost invisible, like a reflection catching the light in a way it shouldn't. I froze, caught between wanting to stop and needing to verify what I thought I saw. My pulse quickened, a low, steady insistence, reminding me that attention has weight. For a moment, I wondered if the object was even recorded during the dive, or if it had been introduced by some unseen force while I watched. Rationality faltered under the pull of the unknown. My legs ached from standing too long, and yet I didn't step back. The hum of the station's systems felt amplified in contrast to the stillness of the footage. Each replay pressed against my memory, bending familiarity into suspicion. I thought about the rule and why it existed. 3 repetitions, not 2, not 4. The specificity of it made me uncomfortable, the sense that exceeding that limit invited consequences not yet defined. I tried to distract myself by checking metadata, file properties, and timestamps, all the while aware that my gaze kept drifting back to the loop. Each attempt at rationalization felt flimsy, inadequate against the creeping tension of repeated observation. Even mundane features, the curvature of sediment, the placement of cables, now seemed charged with possibility. My mind read signals into everything that had previously gone unnoticed. By the third replay, shadows in the corner of the frame seemed to linger longer than the others, subtle but undeniable. My body wanted to move away, but my attention stayed locked in. There was a silent insistence in the repetition, a demand for recognition I couldn't ignore. I realized that the footage wasn't just showing the dive, it was teaching me how repetition itself reshaped perception. I finally forced myself to stop at the third viewing, shutting the sequence off entirely. Even then, the after-image lingered in my vision, tiny distortions that seemed to persist outside the terminal screen. My chest tightened slightly, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The lesson was learned, the cost paid. The sequence no longer needed to play for me to feel its influence, subtly bending my awareness. I stepped back from the terminal, trying to ground myself in the physical space of the bay, counting equipment, noting wall panels, anything neutral. My fingers trembled slightly as I rubbed them together. The sequence remained in my mind, a quiet, insistent echo, reminding me that rules weren't arbitrary, they were shields. And for a moment I understood that repetition could erode them faster than any external threat. I learned the weight of this rule the hard way, staring at a freshly swapped memory card in my hand, while the previous dive footage still glowed on the terminal. Rule 9. Never remove or replace the memory card until the footage has been fully analyzed. I'd thought it was a simple precaution, backup, storage, rotation, but as my thumb hovered over the eject button, an uneasy pulse ran through me. Something in the room shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if the card itself carried more than raw data. My instincts screamed to wait, to resist, but the practical part of me wanted closure. The terminal had already loaded the previous dive's content for review, the images frozen in stark clarity. Each frame seemed more alive than before, shadows lingering where they shouldn't, currents moving in improbable directions. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that deep water refracts light, and that particulate behavior can be misleading. Yet every justification felt incomplete, a paper-thin shield against a deeper, unspoken pressure. The card in my hand suddenly felt like it contained a fragment of that pressure itself. I reached toward the card, hesitating, aware of the tactile familiarity of holding it. My fingers brushed the metal casing, cool, smooth, almost inviting. For a moment I considered just reinserting it and moving on, pretending the footage was fully accounted for. But the memory of past errors, of overlooked anomalies and misaligned timestamps, urged restraint. There was an unspoken rule embedded in every action, a boundary I couldn't cross without consequence. My eyes flicked back to the terminal screen, and the lingering frames seemed almost expectant. I could almost feel the sediment in those images shifting subtly in response to my decision. Each micro-adjustment of the camera perspective I had made before echoed in my mind, a reminder that actions in the review space had unseen impact. The card wasn't just storage, it was a tether, holding experience in place until I fully comprehended it. I put the card down on the console, trying to steady my breathing. The hum of the station filled the small bay, each vibration reminding me of the constant pressure outside. I forced myself to focus on the footage rather than the physical object in my hand, analyzing every frame methodically. The effort was exhausting, the mental strain of watching and cross-checking amplifying the subtle tension in my shoulders. Every subtle anomaly felt magnified under the rule's invisible weight. Time became hard to gauge as I methodically went frame by frame. I noticed minor reflections, a flicker in the corner, shadows that didn't align with anything on the dive log. Each observation felt critical, as if missing even one would corrupt the integrity of the entire dive record. I realized then that removing the memory card too early wouldn't just risk losing footage, it would sever the subtle feedback loop that the rules depended on to keep me oriented. My hands ached from scrolling and adjusting the terminal, but I refused to stop. Every instinct screamed for rest, for a simple release, remove the card, rotate it out, start fresh. Yet that release carried a subtle terror, a quiet whisper that doing so too soon could allow details to slip permanently. I realized the rule existed not just for technical reasons, but to guard against the erosion of observation itself. By the time I finally finished the review, I felt physically drained, mentally stretched thin, yet strangely alert. The footage was cataloged, cross-referenced, and mentally embedded in my awareness. I lifted the memory card, now cleared of active tension, and slid it into the secure storage slot with deliberate care. The act felt final, almost ceremonial, a small acknowledgement that observation and restraint were inseparable. I stepped back, letting my body release the tautness of hours spent at the terminal. Even after removing the card, I felt a lingering unease, a subtle awareness that my choices in reviewing and delaying removal had shaped not only the understanding of the dive, but the room itself. The bay hummed steadily, indifferent, yet I could feel a residue, a quiet insistence, reminding me that the sequence of attention mattered more than the object I now held. I learned this rule in the quietest way possible, the kind that doesn't announce itself until after it's too late to pretend nothing happened. Rule 10. Never leave the terminal unattended while the footage is actively processing. I thought I could step out for a moment, just a quick stretch, a sip of water, but as I walked away, the hum of the bay suddenly felt different, heavier somehow, pressing down into my shoulders. The screen glowed faintly, the progress bar crawling across the frame with a deliberate slowness that seemed almost mocking. The moment I turned my back, the room's ambient light shifted, subtle but noticeable, reflections dancing along the walls where none should have moved. I told myself it was fatigue or the shifting angle of the night cycle lights, but my intuition whispered a quiet warning. something I couldn't fully articulate. I tried to glance back at the terminal without stepping closer, and the footage flickered, the processed frames dissolving for a fraction of a second. It was enough to make my pulse spike. I returned immediately, apologizing to the empty bay, as if speaking might reset the atmosphere. The terminal was fine, or at least it appeared to be, but I felt a weight pressing on the back of my neck that wasn't there before. Every movement on the screen seemed sharper, more deliberate, as if the footage itself had noticed my absence. I had always trusted machines to be indifferent, yet now the hum of processing felt like attention focused in my absence. Sitting back down, I watched the sequence I'd left mid-process, trying to anchor myself in technical detail, frame rate, resolution, compression artifacts. I knew all the parameters, but my mind insisted there was something off. The more I scrutinized, the more subtle inconsistencies appeared, tiny shadows, minute shifts in sediment, lighting that bent differently than physics allowed. I realized that leaving it alone had allowed these small anomalies to surface in ways I couldn't predict. I told myself to breathe, to slow down, to maintain professional detachment. But the quiet insistence of the bay worked against me, each mechanical vibration magnified in the emptiness. My eyes darted toward the ceiling, the corners of the room, anywhere I could measure the environment outside the screen. Everything felt slightly unaligned, as if time had stretched while I was gone. The footage, once merely recorded memory, now demanded my full presence. I noticed subtle flickers again, tiny distortions at the edge of frames I thought I knew intimately. My fingers hovered over the controls, tempted to rewind, to scrub slowly, to correct perception with repeated observation. I remembered the previous rules in fragments, half-formed warnings, and realized this one was different. It wasn't about safety, or clarity, or even memory. It was about attention itself. Leaving the terminal unattended allowed the footage to occupy a space in perception that was no longer bound by conscious oversight. Hours, or what felt like hours, though probably only minutes, passed in near silence, the processing finally completing. I exhaled, letting tension drain from my shoulders, but the unease lingered. The frames held their clarity, yet I couldn't shake the impression that the bay had shifted in my absence, that something subtle had been allowed to slip through while I stepped away. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake the residue of quiet dread that had settled into my chest. The rule's intent was clear now. Even the smallest absence of attention could bend perception, create openings where anomalies could creep into consciousness. I understood then that processing didn't only refer to the footage, it referred to the way my mind and body processed exposure to the deep, to isolation, and to unknown elements lurking just out of reach. Finally, I stood, stretching stiff muscles and taking a slow breath. The terminal hummed steadily, indifferent, yet I could feel the imprint of my earlier lapse etched into the room, subtle and permanent. The lesson was quiet, insidious, and unmistakable. Unattended attention invites consequence in ways you only recognize when you return. The bay seemed unchanged, but I knew better. I had crossed a line I wouldn't see again so clearly. I understood the true weight of this rule. The moment I paused the terminal on a shadow that shouldn't have existed, one that flickered faintly at the edge of the trench wall. Rule 11. Never investigate anomalies in the footage beyond what you were trained to recognize. I had convinced myself that training was just a guideline, that curiosity and professionalism could coexist without consequence. But as I reached for the zoom and adjustment controls, the bay seemed to contract around me, the lights dimming fractionally, as if they were watching. My breath caught, hesitation clinging to my fingers like cold water. The shape wasn't large, not threatening in any conventional sense. It was subtle, a distortion that I could rationalize if I wanted. A misaligned reflection, a particle suspended just so, a shadow cast oddly by the camera's own light. Yet my mind refused to settle. Every instinct urged me to identify it, name it, understand it, and every fiber of the rules screamed against it. That tension pulsed through me, tight and insistent, impossible to ignore. I leaned closer, my face near the screen, trying to discern detail. The image resisted clarity, edges flickering unpredictably, almost like a living hesitation. My hands trembled slightly above the controls, caught between the compulsion to investigate and the knowledge that doing so was forbidden. I told myself the rule existed for safety, for maintaining objectivity, for preserving distance. Yet all of those explanations felt secondary to a primal caution lodged deep in my chest. Every adjustment I made, even minor, seemed to amplify the anomaly, making it insist on my attention more. I realized, with slow dread, that investigation didn't just reveal information. It altered perception. The trench seemed deeper, shadows longer, particles moving in deliberate opposition to currents I knew were constant. My pulse echoed in my ears, a metronome marking time I couldn't measure. Even the lights on the console flickered subtly, as if in tandem with the anomaly's presence. I thought of Malik's voice from months ago, a quiet warning I had dismissed. Some things are not meant for human eyes, not until we understand what it costs to see them. At the time I nodded without comprehension, but now, facing the anomaly alone, I grasped its meaning fully. The footage was patient, willing to show you only what you could handle. An investigation beyond training was a breach of that delicate balance. I tried to step back, to close the footage, to stop engaging, but the anomaly persisted, embedded in memory more than screen, lingering in the periphery of vision like a half-formed threat. Every attempt to distance myself made it more insistent, a quiet awareness pressing against my perception. I understood then that some knowledge once pursued cannot be ignored, even if you retreat. Hours or maybe minutes passed, though I had no way to measure them accurately. The shadow remained, and with it, a creeping sense of comprehension I hadn't anticipated, that my training existed not just to guide action, but to preserve sanity. The deeper I probed, the more the room seemed to bend, the trench on screen growing in ways my mind resisted labeling. Finally, I released the controls and leaned back, heart thudding, aware that nothing in the bay felt entirely unchanged. The shadow persisted faintly in my memory, more insistent than it had any right to be. I realized that this final rule was not a suggestion. It was a boundary, one that if crossed, reshaped both what I saw and how I experienced it. The terminal hummed steadily, indifferent, but I knew better. The anomaly was still there, waiting, patient, untouchable. I stood, stretching my cramped shoulders, breathing shallowly, and in that silence, understood the full gravity of obedience. Some rules aren't about procedure, they are about survival, in ways you don't recognize until you've already risked the cost. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.